Hello, I am Deacon Ezra. I'm speaking to you from St. Elijah Orthodox Church here in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in the United States. Why should you listen to me? I have no idea. I'm a nobody. I am not an Orthodox theologian, nor am I authorized to speak on behalf of the Orthodox Church, and so I don't. I am simply an Orthodox Christian sharing what we have heard, what we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked upon, what our hands have handled concerning the word of life. I discovered the Orthodox faith many years ago. So would you let me introduce myself to you just quickly? Let me tell you that I was raised in a Protestant home. Was a simple believer as a kid. And it was the summer before my 9th grade. They consolidated the school system, and those of us that lived on the west side of town were now bused to the east side of town into a single school. This had happened when we were in the 8th grade, and it was now the summer after that first year of merging the two together. And one of the East Side girls, one of the popular girls in my class, had invited me to be her date at a church function, youth function at her church. And I had gladly said hello and yes, because it was a chance to feel accepted by the East Side crowd from being just one of those guys, one of those West Side boys. Plus I was flattered. She was a nice girl, attractive and very popular. And as it turned out, the week before the date was to take place, I came down with one of those horrible summer sore throats. Absolutely horrible, swollen tonsils, all of the stuff. You know, did all of the treatments that you do, etc., etc. It wasn't strep, didn't need penicillin. And I prayed. Oh God, heal me, heal me, heal me. I had no doubt He would do that. It wasn't because I was special. I was just a simple child with childlike faith believing. And the morning of the party rolled around. I no longer had any fever, but my throat hurt like fire. I'll show God I'm going to go to this party anyway. And so her mom driving the car, she came and picked me up, and I went to the party. And of course, I didn't have a whole lot of energy, didn't have much strength. I did the best I could to be bright and alive and alert, and I felt absolutely lifeless the whole time. I would like to think that it was okay, but I also must confess it was the first and only date I ever had with her. Now I need to also tell you we remained good friends. And in fact, The day we graduated together as seniors from high school, she and I walked side by side. We had to pick a partner to walk, and she had asked me to walk with her. And so we remained friends and would be friends till this day. But something happened to me and God because of it. I chose to no longer believe in God. Ha! Why should I believe in you? You wouldn't heal me, and I asked you to, and I believed, and I was honest, and I can live my life without you, so there. So here I am, ninth grader. I don't believe anything. I'm still going to church with my parents. That'd have killed me if I hadn't. Got elected president of the youth group going into my senior year, the summer of my senior year, and I didn't believe it. It just so happens that I made a very, very good friend that summer. I had been on the debate team in high school, and my friend who had been my debate partner for my first 2 years happened to be a year ahead of me, though we were the same age. And so I was now in need of a new debate partner my senior year, and I asked Mike to be that. And he and I, when you're debate partners, you grow very close together, you spend a lot of time together. And Mike invited me to his church. And so on Sunday nights, Sunday mornings, I would go to my church, and on Sunday nights I would go to Mike's church and began to be part of that youth group there. And then one Sunday evening that summer, while we were at Mike's church, I got the shock of my life. Mike had been asked by the preacher give the homily, the sermon that night. And so he did. And he spoke about God in his life and how he had not always followed that, etc., etc. I was so taken by his honesty, by his confession publicly, that it spoke to my core being. That night, coming home and now being ready to crawl in bed, I did something I had not done in years. I knelt beside my bed and I said simply, God, if you're real, save me. That was the only religious language I knew to speak, and so that's what I said. And it seemed instantaneously that something happened. Now this sounds strange coming from an Orthodox deacon, I know. And yet it shouldn't, because Moses was on the backside of nowhere chasing a bunch of smelly sheep when he turned aside and noticed that bush was burning. This was my turning aside moment. And when I woke up the next morning, the very first conscious thought in my head was that I had been called, again the only religious language I knew, that I had been called to some kind of full-time Christian service. Mike and I graduated then. I started our senior year together, debating together. We graduated the following spring and went off to a denominational university as roommates together that fall. I began as a religion major, and in my required Old Testament class, the latest archaeological findings would suggest that the first 11 chapters of Genesis were not historically correct, that there was no Adam and Eve, no Noah, etc. And so we started with the 11th chapter, Abraham. I couldn't take all that in, and so I went to the registrar's office the next day and I changed my major from religion to philosophy. I put my Bible on the shelf and I never opened it again the 4 years I was at the university. And on the day I graduated from the university, one of my fellow classmates asked me, "Well, what's next? What are you going to do next? What's headed?" And I looked at him and I said, "I'm going to seminary." And he chuckled with this great incredulity, says, "What in the world for?" And I simply said, "I want to see if there's anything left to believe in." As I had left my parents' home my freshman year, my first leaving home, driving off to college, my father had stood as I got into my car, held out his hand, and I shook it, and he said, "Keep the faith." And so I guess in some way I was keeping the faith to go to seminary to see if there was anything left to believe in. Now, I'm not faulting the professor, I'm just telling you my experience. So I go to my denominational seminary, and in my required Old Testament class, the professor says, "Oh, by the way, there is no Adam, there is no Eve, there is no Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We threw away the book of Genesis and began with Moses in the book of Exodus." In my New Testament classes, I began to be taught German theology, Rudolf Bultmann's demythologizing the Bible, particularly demythologizing the New Testament, which was a way to make the New Testament without the invisible, which our culture rejected, to then somehow make the gospel acceptable in non-religious language. I was on a quest when I left the university to see if there was anything left to believe in. That quest took me to seminary, then went to Europe and studied in Switzerland, still on the quest. God has such a sense of humor. Someone asked me as I was headed to Switzerland, "Are you going to L'Abri and see Francis Schaeffer?" I was familiar with his name, had seen his paperback books for sale, had flipped through them to see if he ever mentioned Rudolf Bultmann, and never finding anything, I returned the favor by saying, "No thank you, Francis Schaeffer has nothing to say to me." My life is headed this direction on a quest, and that quest took me eventually, and I'm just going to briefly shorten this quickly, took me to a moment when I put my last $10 to buy gasoline to put in my car to drive to a little country church in view of becoming their pastor. I was to preach that morning, that night, and if they liked me, it was one of those independent kind of situations, without a bishop, without a hierarchy. And if the people thought I did a good job and wanted me, they would then say, we'll hire you to be our preacher. And so they did. And as I was about to leave, a lady came up to me and handed me a check. And I said, what's this? And she said, it's your first week's pay. We pay the preacher a week in advance. So I went home that night, having been broke that morning, with my first paycheck. I got home that evening, and by now it's late, and the phone rings. It was someone from that church telling me that a member of the church was in a nearby hospital dying, and I needed to go. And so I got dressed, drove to that hospital, went to the ICU room unit, found the family, spoke with the man, and the man's wife, his leg had been amputated from the above the knee down due to diabetes. Walked out into the hall with me, and we walked down that long hall. And that precious lady needed something I didn't have to give. She did not need platitudes. She did not need a Hallmark generic, it's in God's hand kind of thing. She needed faith. I left that night as I walked out of the hospital, and I prayed, let that man live long enough for me to begin finding an answer for his wife. The next day I drove to a little Christian bookstore, parked outside, and as I walked in I asked for guidance. If there's anything in here to begin helping me, let me find it. You see, I was on the quest and didn't know it. And so I found myself in front of a rack with Francis Schaeffer's books on it. And I walked out of there with two of them. Escape from Reason, and He is there, and He is not silent. And on that day, God began rebuilding a faith I once had, a faith in God, not theology, not dogma, just God is. He lived 6 weeks. 6 months. And in that 6-month period, I began finding some answers. Is there anything left to believe in? And I had a flicker of hope. There was. A week after that man died, I was in that same hospital again. This time with a family of a 7-year-old girl dying from neuroblastoma, cancer of the brain that afflicts children. The family was in the room. Her uncle was holding her, and I watched her die. It was the first time I had ever witnessed a death. I began in earnest that quest. Is there anything to believe in? That quest eventually led me to a little bitty church in downtown Oklahoma City, St. Elijah Orthodox Church. My wife and I took the Inquirer's classes. I began enrolling, learning some more stuff. And the day came, 2 or 3 years later, I'm still pastoring my little Protestant church. I came to believe that the Eastern Orthodox Church was the church that Jesus built. I resigned. I called Father Constantine Nasser, the pastor, the priest of St. Elijah at that time, and told him that I had resigned and my wife and I and our children would be at St. Elijah the next Sunday, that we wanted to become members, however that process worked. And so that the first Sunday in February 1991, we walked into the sanctuary of St. Elijah for the Divine Liturgy for the very first time. We had never been to church during the liturgy because I'd always been preaching at my church. That would have been the 1st February of 1991. At the door that day, I remember consciously giving up everything I'd ever been taught about the church, theology, dogma, everything I thought I knew about God. Because I didn't want any of that piggybacking itself in on my back, unknown to me, and beginning to then color, discolor, and let me think that I knew something when I didn't. My wife and I came in as blank slates to allow the church to now teach us who God is, who the church is, what salvation is, and so forth. Through the years, I was asked to teach a little Wednesday Bible study. I was fearful for those retirees that I would say something that was Protestant, and so I went to the church library and got St. John Chrysostom's commentary on Matthew, and I would read his comments on whatever passage of Matthew we were studying and would digest it to be able to then give it to that class. And so little by little I began learning biblical theology by reading St. John Chrysostom. Began letting the church teach me who she is and what we believe. I began reading some of the books that were available. Father Schmimmen's book on the Eucharist, Losky's book on the mystical theology of the Eastern Church. Brick by brick began putting myself back together, that there was something to believe in. A year or two or 3 or 4 years later, the inquirers class at the church was taught by both Father Constantine and Father Basil. Team taught one week, one the next, on various topics. And they had a topic on the church and Holy Scripture, and they asked me to teach that one. A couple of more years went by with me teaching that one session when the series would come around. And they asked me to teach the class on Holy Tradition, the Church and Holy Tradition. And so I taught 2 of the 8 classes, or 9 classes, every time we taught them, all the way up until 2000. And in 2000, I was ordained a subdeacon, Subdeacon Ezra. And we had a group in our church, a sizable group that lived in Norman, Oklahoma, about 30 miles from the University of Oklahoma is. And they needed and wanted the inquirers class to be taught there, in their hopes of beginning then to have an outreach so that eventually they could become a mission, which eventually would happen there. And so it was going into the Lenten season. Our priests, of course, our clergy were very, very busy. And so on a Monday night, I drove the 30 miles to Norman, and I ended up teaching all 8 of the inquirers classes. It was the first time for St. Elijah that one person had taught all of them. We had always done team teaching. And so it became the first time, and when you teach all of them, you began to be able to link them a little tighter together. They weren't just little beads on a necklace. They actually were more integrated. And out of that grew us having a class, because if I were going to teach all of the inquirers classes, that freed up Father Constantine and Father Basil to teach something else, which they'd always wanted to do, the next level. And so we began a Wednesday night class for that summer of 2000. Eventually, we took the name Family Night, maybe borrowed it from St. George Houston in Houston, Texas. We borrowed the name, not the concept of what we were doing for Family Night. And so many people came, we did it again that fall. That was the summer of 2000. It is now the summer of 2024, 25 years later, and we are in the middle of our Family Night, and I'm still teaching all 8 of those inquirers classes 3 or 4 times a year for the last 25 years. Eventually we videoed those, originally with VHS capability, later with digital capability. Later they were put on the internet, eventually finding the church Jesus built went through some different changes because of a different audience over the 20 years of people coming to find the faith. We printed a little book, Finding the Church Jesus Built, that was now much more accessible than the large manual we did originally. And out of that then, eventually we had a new priest. Father Basil had passed away. And we had a new priest, assistant priest, Father Jeremy Davis, now higher monk, Father Jeremy. And he came to me and said, would it be possible for me to teach an inquirer's class to set? Because someday I will be transferred and I will need an inquirer's class. And of course we said yes. And it gave me a chance to do something else that I hadn't done in years. And the outcome of that was these things I believe. Our daughter was going off to college. It caused a flood of memory of the day I had left and my father saying, keep the faith. And I had an opportunity then to realize I'm going to see if there's anything left to believe in. And I call that series, These Things I Believe. We had just finished up those 8 weeks when I got a phone call from, above all people, Frank Schaeffer, the son of Francis Schaeffer, asking me if I had any kind of manuscript available that he might publish. I told him about these things I believe. We hurriedly tweaked it, sent it off, and he actually published it. Doesn't God have a wonderful sense of humor? Are you going to go to L'Abri? No, Francis Schaeffer has nothing for me. Now, I'd walked into that bookstore and I ended up buying Schaeffer's book. And now it was Schaeffer's son printing an Orthodox book that I had written. Eventually that got taped and is available online. In the life of the church, eventually I become the church administrator here. I'm still always teaching Finding the Church Jesus Built. And somehow the more I grew in the Orthodox faith, the more I read, the more I learned, the more all of that emptiness that needed to be rebuilt was being rebuilt. The quest, is there anything left to believe in, went beyond these things I believe. I began dealing with those issues in culture that wipe out the foundation of belief. I explored that, not knowing I was doing it yet, as the quest. In a seminar series, These Things I Believe was done. The second one was Paradise Has Two Trees. It was an investigation. What happened in paradise in terms of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life? In terms of philosophical thinking, what happened epistemologically? What happened in how we think? Knowledge, what is it? And it was a journey to explore that. I didn't have an answer. Let's go see what there is to see here. We offered a seminar, and by God's grace, people came. The notes were being written weekly, passed out, eventually then collected, published also as a book. Paradise Has Two Trees. Looking at the epistemological categories of thinking. How can you even think religiously? I don't know what amount of time passed next, but then encountering the story of Christ healing the naked man in chains, the Gadarene, who was found clothed and in his right mind, and led by the Spirit of God. What is right-mindedness? What is cultural insanity? As I witnessed and watched my own Western culture seem to go insane. Up was no longer up, down was no longer down. Good was no longer good, evil was no longer evil. What's going on? And so the question of being right-minded in a culture, and what is right-mindedness, culturally speaking, began to be explored without knowing where it would take us, in Naked in a Graveyard. Naked in a graveyard, and in a society then that drove the right-minded to Jesus Christ, who creates right-mindedness, drove him away from their midst. And then to that trilogy, kind of as a footnote, as a PS, I began that study, Here I Stand. How do we make a choice? What's involved in making a choice? Here I stand. Who do I stand with? Who do I stand for? We all know the old saying, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. It wasn't that simple. I remember having been in Germany, in the city of Worms, at the Luther Denkmal, the Lutheran Memorial there, in honor of the Protestant Reformation, and standing before that huge pedestal and that massive statue of Martin Luther, and on the plaque in German, Hier stehe ich kann nichts andere. Here I stand, I can do no other. I remember walking over there on that plaza, and there in the floor was that tile that said, "Here stood Martin Luther," marking the spot where he had stood to make his stand against the Pope and the Catholic Emperor. Here I stand. And so I began exploring that as a PS. By this time, I had been asked by college friends, "What happened to you? How did you become Orthodox?" And I guess it was kind of, I don't know, but let me map it out. On the point of view, the issue of how do you make a stand? How do you make a decision? And so here I stand. Luther versus Peter came into play. The quest, how I became Orthodox, what I found, speaking not always religious language, speaking philosophical language that has undergirded and wiped out the foundation of faith in our culture. Along the way, inside of that, all of those, there was a massive study of the Gospel of John. How grateful I am to those people, about 50 of them, that came week after week with over 50 sessions and episodes that we covered the Gospel of John. John, the mystagogic Gospel. Eventually, during the pandemic, there were people, my culture was panicking. Is this the end of the world? Is this one of the plagues of the book of Revelation? And I thought maybe it's time to actually go on a journey and let's find out what the apocalypse is really all about from the ground up. And so we began that journey during the pandemic. It ended up being 3 volumes. Because it was the pandemic after it was created, we couldn't have a class. And so I taught it in this room to that camera. My goodness. Since then, I've had a chance to teach it on Thursday mornings. Discovering if John wrote this, how do we do this? And we found we got someplace. You don't have to agree with where we get, but I invite you to take the journey and see what you think about each of them as we take the journey together. And then we come to the latest one, just now being released on the internet, the mystagogic liturgy. At lunch today, I had a gentleman ask me, what triggered this one, this investigation, this journey, especially since it starts out without just a nice, easy intro, but a little bit advanced. He happens to be part of that apocalypse class that's almost to the end. And I told him it's because of the last chapters of the book of Revelation. The new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem, which of course is the church, where God now dwells among His people, and there's no longer an earthly temple like the one that used to exist in Jerusalem. And I looked at him and I said, that's the church, and that's the divine liturgy. The upper room is the new Jerusalem. And so I couldn't just jump. The Apocalypse series is 3 volumes, and in a sense, the Apocalypse is the 4th volume. I mean, the mystagogic liturgy is the 4th volume, and yet it's a standalone volume. And it has its own beginning, so it's not just a quick jump from the other, but if you had made the apocalyptic journey, at least you would be used to thinking in a heavier category. And so I've put a preface in that book, apologizing for it starting out so heavy and suggesting that if you can't make the climb up to the top floor to take the elevator and fast forward a few floors past the tough stuff to get to it. I've introduced myself to you, and I've introduced to you the quest, the different journeys I've taken, because I know nothing, knew nothing, and I know only what the church has taught me, and I hope I have not misunderstood. And if I have, I ask you to forgive me. Sometimes I get excited and passionate because this is life. Is there anything left to believe in? Has been the quest of my life. And I want you to know, yes, there is. And I've been sharing what I have found again and again and again and again in seminars that have been taped by God's grace and in books. I never intended to do any of it, and yet somehow it has come to pass, and somehow you have found us online on the internet. And so I welcome you. I say thank you to you. The channels on YouTube are available. Orthodox Christianity 101. I think St. Elijah OKC are the two channels. The books are available from Amazon.com. Some of you send emails and I try to answer them. Some of you have telephoned and I've tried to speak with you on the phone. I'm still the full-time administrator here at the church, and so it's a hectic schedule. But God bless you. God love you. Some of you have even stopped by as you're traveling across the country to worship with us and to say hello. That's so kind of you. But when it's all said and done, it's what John said in his first letter, what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have experienced. It is not the academic knowledge. It is not the church fathers quoted. It is the experience of the living presence of God in the church. The living presence of being part of the body of Christ, a parish, and learning how to live within a group and not just an isolated, Americanized individual, but becoming part of a parish. With each parish and every church a little different. The way each of us is different. I am filled with gratitude for the Orthodox faith. I am grateful by God's mercy and grace that when that side and found that little church, went to that little church, we didn't find it, and discovered this faith once for all delivered to the saints. God bless you. Welcome to Orthodox Christianity 101 and all the open fields that lie ahead. Amen.